The Aldivirn Lodge by Thomas Price. Written for my sister Kathryn and my cousin Joseph. Happy birthday. Starring Sam Darby Moorhouse as Alex, Serky as the Attendant, and Lilian McCann as Inez. Chapter 1. In the Ashen Forest. I opened my eyes to see that I was deep in a strange forest. I had no memory of this forest, no memory of how I got there or why I came, and it looked like no forest I had ever seen. It was dark, as if it was night, but it wasn't night. There were no stars or moon in the sky. There weren't even clouds that could obscure them. There was no sky, just empty blackness. I shivered. I could still see ahead of me. The snow that coated the landscape let off a very faint white light, and I wondered from what clouds had this snow fallen. I noticed that, despite my shiver, I was not cold. It was a strange feeling. It wasn't fear or sadness or anger or joy or any other emotion known to me, but it gave me such a sense of déjà vu. Had I always felt this way, and only now realized it? I began moving, with my own realization, being so caught up in the sensation in my chest, and it was only the fragile crunching of snow that made me notice. I didn't do anything to stop it. There was nowhere I needed to go, after all. Why not let my unconscious mind take me somewhere? I walked. The forest was silent aside from my footsteps in the snow, but it was peaceful. It was silence in its truest form, when you can't even hear the tiny breaths of animals in the undergrowth or the rustle of leaves in the trees. Perhaps I was the only living thing in the entire forest, if I could be called alive anyway, because despite the trees standing tall, I could not consider them alive. I couldn't even see how high they went. The darkness obscured their leaves from me. Calling the place a forest began to seem less and less true as I walked. There was nothing aside from the trees, which were aligned in perfect rows. The ground was flat and hard-packed with snow. It reminded me far more of a graveyard, with each tree taking the place of a headstone. I was wrong. It was not snow that was beneath my feet. It was ash, packed and pressed. I learnt this by crouching down to touch it. It wasn't cold, and it was dry as bone. It clung to my fingers like dust, which I quickly brushed off. That strange feeling in my chest was back. It wasn't exactly an emotion, or a physical sensation. It was something in between. I kept walking. There was something in the distance, something that emitted the light that promised shelter from the darkness. I kept walking until I stood before it. It was a lodge, made of logs and stone. The light was pouring out the windows, so much that I couldn't see inside. It was about 3 stories tall and had a stone chimney that was belching smoke on the roof. In the front stood a set of double doors, made of thick oak so ancient it had begun to fossilize. I reached out to touch it and found it was invitingly warm, like sunlight. My hand lingered there, basking in that heat. It was at this moment I realized I felt different in a very physical sense. I felt lighter. Any aches or pains I had before were gone. Those little marks on my fingers or my arms, my scars, were gone too. And yet, I didn't feel things as I had before. I couldn't feel my clothes against my skin, despite wearing the shirt and jeans I always wore. The physicality of the door was by far overshadowed by its warmth. I could barely feel the ground beneath me, and then that feeling in my chest returned. The strange mix of sensation and emotion. No, it was more like a lack of the latter. An emptiness in my heart. I knocked on the door. After a while, I heard the door creak, and slowly it was opened by a young person whose gender I couldn't quite guess. They had dark skin and both masculine and feminine features. Their face was expressionless, emotionless, and wordlessly they stood aside and invited me into the lodge. I hesitated. My feet were not moving for me now. I had to choose to step through the door. I looked back out into the dark forest, and then back at the doorway. I stepped inside, and heard them say,
"Welcome to the Aldivirn Lodge. I hope you enjoy your stay."
I said nervously. "I will. Thank you." But when I turned to look at them, they were gone. Chapter 2. Music in the Lodge. The lodge itself was cosy and warm. There was a large fireplace in the wall furthest from me, and the fire in it made the shadows of the place dance. There were only oil lanterns that were mostly burnt out for any other illumination, so I basked in the half-light and made my way over to one of the armchairs next to the fire. I sank into it, letting the crackling fire warm my body, and then I waited there, tapping my fingers in time with the crackling, for something to happen. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Maybe it was for the young attendant to come back and explain what was happening, but if I was being honest with myself, I was only sitting there because I didn't have anything better to do. I never really did. After a while, I noticed I was not alone. A woman was sitting in the opposing armchair, politely watching me. I hadn't heard her come in. She seemed surprised I had taken notice of her, and in a quiet voice, with an accent that was French or possibly Russian, she said,
"Bonjour, monsieur."
"Oui?" I said back. I wasn't good at talking to people I didn't know. I wasn't good at it even when I knew them.
"Vous ne parlez pas français, monsieur?"
Embarrassed, it took me a moment to respond. No. Sorry." She nodded.
"It is fine. My apologies. I did not mean to interrupt. You looked very focused on your tapping."
I made a note of my tapping and grabbed onto my legs to steady my hands. I found it helped me to stop fidgeting. I looked at her, and not knowing what to say, I said, "I didn't hear you come in." She didn't follow up with anything, and so a silence set in. It wasn't like the silence outside. I could still hear her, my own breathing, and the fire still crackled with a slightly uneven regularity. I felt a very human anxiety, an uncomfortableness at being in this woman's sight. I think she felt the same way, because after a few seconds she averted her gaze from me. I needed to break the silence, but for the life of me I couldn't. So now, both of us were waiting in that lodge. As we waited, I started to hear the wind outside pick up, lightly at first, but slowly becoming a gale over time. I could only imagine a blizzard of ash was raging outside, all flurrying movement and unstoppable wind. The woman got out of her chair and began to unsteadily walk toward the window. When she looked outside, she gasped and took a step back. I got out of my chair to take a look through the glass and felt a dull surprise at what I saw. There was no storm out there, no snow or sleet. What there was an inky abyss so dark that it wasn't simply an absence of light, but the denial that light had ever existed. It felt like I could fall into that darkness, and it would be as if I had never existed. The woman was breathing heavily. Between breaths, she was whispering something to herself, something French that I couldn't understand. Then she turned to me and asked in disbelief,
"Why are you so calm?"
I think I shrugged. I didn't really have the energy to talk to her. That sensation was back. I managed to say, "I thought there was a blizzard outside."
"A blizzard? This is what you're worried about? If that is what is beyond those walls, how do we go home? How do we leave this place? Do you even know where we are?"
I don't, sorry." She just nodded. Her thoughts were apparently beyond the scope of words. She stumbled back into her chair and sank into it. I stayed by the window for a while, but I realized quickly that there was nothing to see out in that darkness, and the more I strained my eyes, the more obvious that fact was to me. Defeated, I went back to my chair and sat. The crackling of the fire and the howling wind continued with almost rhythmical timing, but the two of us just sat in silence. There was nothing I could think of to say, and even if I did, I lacked the energy to say it. The emptiness in my heart seemed to drain me every second that went by. The woman was the one who broke the silence. I heard her sniffle at first, and then she began to quietly weep. It was a respectable sort of crying, the kind that comes when your emotions break through, but you shield your face with one of your hands and look away from the audience so they can't see your shame. I wanted to say something to her. I wanted to tell her it would be okay. Maybe I would hug her, or maybe just offer words of comfort if she wasn't comfortable with the physicality of being held. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. And so, I closed my mouth and left her to cry. We stayed like that for a while. I wasn't sure how long. Time was like light refracted in water, still there, still illuminating things, but distorted, lengthened and shortened and obscuring as much as it chose. I felt myself clutching my legs tightly, trying to keep a part of myself, whilst that emptiness gnawed at it, my personhood. It was such an encompassing feeling that I almost didn't notice a third person had joined us. A teenage girl, maybe around 14, was sitting in the threadbare couch between me and the woman. She wore large, circular glasses and had long, frizzy ginger hair. She gave me a cheerful smile when I looked at her.
Hi!
She gave me a cheerful little wave when she said it. Hi, I managed back. I could feel myself gripping my leg tighter. Somehow I found the strength to ask her, "When did you come in?" before the dryness in my mouth caused me to choke.
Just now. Hey, do either of you know where we are?
I shook my head. The woman in the chair sniffed and forced back her tears.
No, me excuse.
The girl in the chair nodded sagely at this, before absent-mindedly touching her chin and shoulders, almost as if to check they were still there.
Are you all right? Anything I can do?
No, but thank you. I am just a bit overwhelmed, I suppose.
The girl nodded sagely again, before hopping to her feet and began wandering around the lodge. She ran her hand along the wooden coffee table and examined the fireplace. She had a tiny skip to her step, and the sound of her footsteps against the carpeted floor added a light percussion sound to the strange music that was made by the fire and the wind. It was missing something, but I could hear the music in it nonetheless. The girl continued her circuit around the lodge, eventually doing a slight hop and grabbing onto the banister that led upstairs. While hanging there, in an almost nonchalant way, she asked us,
So, what do I call you guys? What are your names?
Names. That was right. I had entirely forgotten to ask anyone their name, and more than that, I had almost forgotten my own name. It had almost fallen into that emptiness and been lost. "Samir," I said.
Inez Marchand.
Cool!
She let go of the banister, dropped to the floor, and turned to face us. She opened her mouth to say something, but then I saw a moment's hesitation cross her face. It quickly passed, and she said to us,
My name's Alex. It's nice to meet you.
It is nice to meet you also.
I could see a small smile on Inez's face. She raised a hand to wipe the last of her tears away.
Did anybody see where that guy went?
Which guy? I asked her.
The guy who welcomed me in here? You know, the well-dressed one. He...
Man? I thought they were a woman.
Maybe they were? I didn't really get a good look at them.
I heard a record scratch as a record player needle searched for its indent. Then the needle found the groove and the music began to play. Piano and saxophone started playing, and the song was lovely and melancholic. I looked over to where the music was coming from, a dark corner under the stairs, and saw an old man holding his hand against the speaker with a contented smile on his face. He swayed gently in time with the music. Inez and Alex noticed him too. Inez was the first to talk, saying,
Hello. Do you know what is going on here?
But the old man didn't turn to respond to her. Inez looked almost hurt at that, as she turned to Alex. Alex shrugged back.
Hey, old man! Can you hear us?
I'm not sure if this did get the old man's attention, but he did turn around. He seemed startled by all of us looking at him, but he quickly regained his composure and smiled at us. He displayed his hands before indicating to his ears and mouth and shaking his head. The man was deaf and mute.
Oh.
She began making rapid hand gestures to the old man, who returned in kind.
His name is Trevor. He says it is a pleasure to meet you all.
You know sign language?
Some. Either way, he can lip read. So if you want to speak to him, make sure you're facing him.
I turned to look at Trevor, who had put his hand back on the speaker, and asked him, Do you know where we are? To which he just shook his head. Do you know who the person who welcomed us in was? He shook his head again. Do you know anything about our current situation at all? He shook his head and shrugged and went back to enjoying his music.
So we do not know what is going on here, yes? Perhaps we should look upstairs.
Sounds good to me. I've always wanted to explore an otherworldly lodge with 3 strangers.
I saw Trevor make a lead-the-way gesture, and we all got out of our seats to explore upstairs. I think I felt the tiny flickers of appreciation for the group that had found its way into the lodge. The sensation in my chest dulled most emotions, most sensations even, but I was sure it was there. As I watched each of them go up the wooden stairs, I wondered if they all felt the emptiness inside of them. I doubted it. Inez had strength enough to cry, Alex could smile, and despite everything feel excitement exploring the place. Even if Trevor did have that emptiness, he could still fill it with music. Maybe I was more isolated from them than I thought. They seemed to care if we left this place, but I could stay here forever, and not even think about going home. I didn't even have a home to go back to.
Samir, are you coming?
One moment, I replied. I took one last look into the warm light of the fire before ascending the stairs to join my companions. I could hear it crackling in my head long after it was out of earshot. Chapter 3. The Endless Hall. The second floor of the lodge was a corridor that seemingly went on forever in both directions. Doors lined the walls at regular intervals, each one labelled with a name. Tiny lanterns gave off light and bathed the floor in shadow. My companions were inspecting the door. I saw Alex try a couple of doors, none of which opened.
They're locked.
I saw Inez face Trevor and she mouthed something to him I didn't catch. He nodded and went to check some of the doors Alex hadn't checked yet. I decided to look at one of the doors myself. The name, engraved and then somehow burned into the wooden door, read Daniel Clerval. I noticed, then, that underneath the name, written in much smaller font, was a number. 1811, 1897. I noticed that Inez was looking over my shoulder at the door. I didn't feel massively comfortable with how close she was, but I also lacked the energy to ask her to move.
Étrange. Do you know who this person was?
I realised she was asking me a question. I shook my head.
You do not talk much. Would you prefer to also communicate with sign language?
No. Sorry, I'm not the best at talking anyway, and I don't feel myself right now. I'd like to keep talking to a minimum, if that's okay with you. She looked at me, observing my body language, probably deciding whether or not to trust me. Eventually, she said,
That is fine with me. I do not feel very stable myself. Keep to yourself. It is no trouble to me.
Thank you. She nodded, and we looked back to Trevor and Alex. Alex was manically talking to Trevor, whilst he would either nod, shake his head, or make a gesture in response.
Maybe they're like safe combinations.
Trevor made a so-so gesture. Alex scratched her chin, clearly deep in thought. Is everything all right?
Yeah, we were just discussing the doors. I thought the door numbers were like room numbers in a hotel, but Trevor disagrees. They aren't in order, you see?
I looked down the wall and saw a few of the numbers. She was right, they weren't. Most of them had the same 8-number layout, but no other connecting pattern that I could see. 29021804 13121512 18010952 22031719 31121900. The names were just as random. I couldn't make any sense of them.
What do you think is in them? The rooms, I mean.
Trevor put his hands together and placed them on the side of his head. He then mimed sleeping. Alex jumped up and down and yelled out.
Oh, bedrooms. They could be bedrooms.
To which Trevor pointed at her like she'd won a point in charades and chuckled. Maybe, I muttered. There was something about the rooms that made me think they were wrong. They were certainly styled after bedrooms, but something was off about it. Maybe it was the numbers. Reading them gave me tiny chills across my body, noticeable enough that even the emptiness couldn't swallow them.
Let's explore up ahead.
Wait!
We all stopped and turned to look at her. She was frantically looking around the floor, searching for something.
What's the matter?
My ring! I cannot find my ring!
Trevor gestured to Inez, then to his eyes, and then to his ring finger.
I cannot remember. I had it when I came in, I am sure, but I do not believe I saw it. Can you please help me find it?
She looked like she was on the verge of tears again, and she was shaking slightly. I said to her, I'll help you look. What kind of ring is it?
Je vous remercie. Thank you, it is a gold wedding ring with a tiny diamond inlaid into it.
I'll look too.
Trevor made some gestures I interpreted as volunteering to help as well. Inez nodded and thanked them. Alex turned to Trevor and said,
Come on, let's look downstairs.
Then Alex ran down the stairs. Trevor smiled, waved to the two of us, and then walked after her. Once again, I was left alone with Inez.
Look between the floorboards. It might have fallen between them.
I nodded and began to look. It was a fool's errand. There wasn't enough light to see, so I was relying entirely on touch. But I could see that it made Inez feel more relieved to see me looking, so I kept going anyway.
I am sorry about this. It is just he would be so disappointed if I lost it. He always talks so much about getting me diamond ring. He thought they were an ultimate display of love, you see.
Somehow I managed to talk to her, despite how much effort it was. I said, Don't worry about it. This your husband we're talking about?
Fiancé. We had to be married in a week, actually.
Oh, sounds nice.
Yes.
And like that, the conversation was over. There was a part of me that wanted to continue it, ask her about her fiancé and her life maybe, but it was beyond me. It always had been that way. I continued to search for her ring until Alex and Trevor came back up the stairs, shaking their heads.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Well, thank you anyway.
Inez had gone pale. She shook gently as she fought away tears. I heard her take a deep breath and say,
I must find that ring. Do you understand? I must find it.
Maybe it's outside?
Outside? If it is outside, then I have lost it forever.
Can't we just check? I asked her.
If I go outside, I will die. Do you not realize this? Do none of you understand? There is nothing for us out there. We are trapped here. And I lost the most important thing he ever gave me.
Angry tears were streaming down her face now. Trevor stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. He made some gestures, but mostly he just gave her a look. It was a kind look, a look of understanding and calm. It was strange to see such a look on a man I'd only just met, but he wore it well. Inez wiped her eyes with that same self-respect as she had before.
Pardon me.
Trevor just nodded and let go of her shoulder. We all stood in silence for a moment.
Hey! Maybe that attendant picked it up.
Alex said it with a cheery and sympathetic smile on her face. Maybe, I said again. Despite the sheer emotion on display from Inez, I still felt that emptiness. I didn't feel particularly sympathetic, but despite that I did hope she found that ring. I wondered for a moment if that ring was like what had ever left me, something that left a gaping hole in its wake. Admittedly, whatever had happened to me seemed more metaphorical, while Inez's ring was a literal thing, but it seemed to follow the logic of this place. What little of it there was, anyway. I took a look at my companions, and I said to them, Shall we keep going? Chapter 4. Doors and Names. I doubted it made any difference which way we went. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, less in a metaphorical way, but in a very literal sense. The doors never stopped, each engraved with their name and number. They reminded me, in a way, of prison cells. We walked for what might have been hours, but just as easily could have been minutes or days. The passing of time didn't seem to register with me like it used to, possibly due to the lack of sensations in my body like hunger or thirst or tiredness. Originally, I assumed this was something to do with the emptiness in my chest, but then I realised that none of my companions had mentioned it either, which made me realise that it was probably something to do about the lodge itself, rather than anything to do with me. That, or perhaps they too felt that emptiness. They just conveyed it differently. We didn't talk much, not that Trevor could, to be fair. I did sometimes hear Alex humming to herself, but it wasn't a song I'd ever heard before. Usually she'd either stop or change the tune after a while. It was around this point I noticed I wasn't craving a drink. I drank a lot, or I used to anyway. It helped in those darker nights, the ones I couldn't see myself getting through, which tended to be most of them. But since I'd woken up in that forest, I hadn't craved some cheap whiskey. I didn't consider this to be a good thing. It wasn't that I had suddenly lost my reliance on alcohol. Rather, it was a part of me that was swallowed up by the void in my heart. I knew that any inebriation I subjected myself to would get swallowed. It would be a waste. As we walked, I had a thought that might have upset me if I had the energy to be upset, and that was that I was exceptionally bored. And that was strange because I was experiencing something so otherworldly. I was walking through an infinite corridor, in a strange lodge that I had found in the middle of an ashen forest that was in perpetual darkness, interacting with people I'd never met, and yet in my heart there was just that emptiness. Perhaps my companions were experiencing a sense of wonder. Alex certainly was, as was Trevor. Inez probably was experiencing a similar emptiness to me, but even she could feel sadness and fear. The only thing I could feel were the flickers of what might have once been emotion. I needed to take my mind off things. I began to read the names on the doors. It wasn't particularly interesting. None of the names or numbers really meant anything to me, but it was better than nothing. Jamie Jones, Mary Cadwallader, Kathryn Bancroft, Shigaraki Kota, Alurda Jalali, Matthew Hughes, Samir Patel. I froze in place, grasped by a fear so acute and so massive that it practically eclipsed the emptiness I felt. Samir Patel. That was my name. Beneath it was just a number, 09081999. But that hardly mattered, because that was my name, and it terrified me. I just stood there, staring at it, dreading what could possibly be behind that door. I heard Alex call out to me.
Hey, Samir. Why'd you stop?
This is my door. My companions looked at each other before coming over to me. They could see it, plain as day. It reflected in their eyes, I was sure of it. My name, which was printed on this door, like it was made specifically for me. I felt sick.
Can you open it?
Yes, I whispered. I wasn't sure how, but I knew I could.
Why have you not opened it then?
I looked at the door again, and then looked at the handle. I saw my hand, shaking and sweaty, unconsciously reach out to take it. Before I could touch the brass handle, I pulled my hand back like I was about to touch fire. I turned to Inez and the rest of the group. I can't open it. I just can't. You wouldn't understand. It's terrible. It's like staring at your own corpse.
But why? Why is it so terrible? Why do you get such a feeling of doom and gloom looking at it?
Vaguely I realised she was probably making a joke, but I knew she had just asked a question I couldn't answer. When people are having a heart attack, it's said they feel a sense of doom, like they could tell they were about to die, and death was inevitable. That was the feeling I was experiencing, but I lacked the strength to explain it to my companions. So I just said, I don't know. Can we please just get away from this door now? It was Trevor who nodded first, walking away and gesturing for us to follow. I could tell that Inez and Alex really wanted to find out what was behind the door, but thankfully they decided to drop it.
Let's get moving then.
She had that smile back on her face, and she practically skipped off to go join Trevor. Inez looked me up and down with hazel eyes.
You look terrible. Are you going to be all right?
Yes. I will be. I just need to be away from the door.
Well, lead the way.
I did, and we caught up with Trevor and Alex. After a while, the fear became dulled and the emptiness returned. But the image in my mind's eye never wavered. The sight of that door haunted me, and I knew it would only be a matter of time before I had to open it and be damned with the truth of what was on the other side. Chapter 5. A toast to that life we once led. None of my companions found their doors as we continued along that infinite corridor. I say infinite, but I knew very well that it was no such thing. There would be a door for every human to ever exist, and then it would stop. Most likely we would just continue on and find ourselves right back where we started. I was starting to wonder if the attendant was ever even real. and perhaps we were just on a fool's errand. Trevor, who was ahead of us, held up his hand for us to stop. He pointed forward, and I saw why. There were steps leading to the 3rd floor off to the side ahead of us. He turned to us and turned his palms upwards in a sort of disgust gesture.
We should go up there.
Whatever conversation we were going to have essentially stopped there, because nobody would give a good reason not to follow through. Trevor and Alex were happy to explore, and I just didn't want to speak to anyone for the time being. It was either go upstairs or continue down that corridor for the rest of eternity. We took the former. Upstairs was designed like a very cosy, very darkly lit pub. A bar was on the rightmost wall of the room, while a fire raged in the back. There were bar stools and armchairs and a couch, and most importantly there was the attendant, the one who had opened the door for me. They stood behind the bar, dressed smartly, and while they still lacked any true emotion on their face, they nodded respectfully as we entered the room, and they gestured for us to sit. Lacking any real alternative, we all sat on the stools at the bar and waited for someone to say something.
Welcome, travellers. May I offer you a drink?
Sure.
She seemed excited at the prospect of drinking at a grown-up bar. We all either nodded or made some sound to the effect of yes. The attendant turned their back to us and began making a strange drink in a large pot, which seemed to release steam without ever having been heated.
Excuse me, but who are you?
Without turning back to us, they said,
I am your attendant, the caretaker of this lodge. I am here to help you along your journey.
Yeah, but who are you, though?
Whatever name I once had has been lost to time, I'm afraid.
They turned to face us, 2 glass mugs in each hand. They placed a white cube, which might have been sugar or might have been ice, into each mug, before taking the pot and pouring a deep, black liquid into each mug. The stuff was fascinating to look at. It was black like night, but foamed like a cappuccino or a beer. The cube floated in the middle of the drink and seemed to fizz.
Please, a toast to the lives you have lived.
The attendant gestured for us all to take our drinks. I was hesitant. I had no reason to trust this person, after all. But at the same time, I lacked the self-preservation instinct to push it away. It had been swallowed by the emptiness. Everyone else had their mugs in their hands, preparing to make the toast. So I joined them.
To the lives you have lived.
All of us except Trevor echoed, "To the lives we have lived," and drank the black liquid. It was a sick joke to make a toast to my life. I hadn't done anything with it. I hadn't changed the world or made it a better place by being in it. I had wasted the time I had been allotted, and I was probably heading straight for an early grave. I already felt like I had half a foot there anyway. And what was worse was that my life was being celebrated with a drink that tasted so amazing. It was warm and sweet like hot chocolate, but also burned like scotch, and yet had a hint of bitter coffee to it. It tasted so incredible that for a moment I forgot that emptiness. It was something that had gone beyond the concept of using tastes to describe it. It was like drinking sunshine.
Wow.
I saw Trevor with the most contented smile on his old face. Inez was completely speechless. For my part, I just stared into the black liquid. Most of the foam had gone, and in the liquid's reflection I could see my face. I looked very tired and very sick, but there was a small smile on my face despite it all.
Hey, attendant? Why did you have to make us toast to the lives we've lived? It just seemed a bit weird, is all.
I had you make that toast to prepare you for my next duty. I am sorry to tell you, but you have all passed away. After you leave this lodge, you will cease to be.
Chapter 6. Echoes and Goodbyes. Silence filled the room. Trevor stared into his glass, deep in thought, while Inez's mouth hung slightly open. Whatever word she wanted to say had died on her tongue. I heard Alex whisper, "No," before taking a deep, shuddering breath. She was clutching her wrist as if to steady herself. I just stared at the attendant and into their eyes that were so ancient they seemed to outlive the world. I felt emotion, real, burning emotion fill me. Fear, anger, despair, sadness, all of it went to the emptiness, and the great void devoured that emotion. But with the flickers left behind, I felt my fists clench, and I yelled at the attendant, "No! That's not true! It can't be true! You're lying to me!" Inez joined me in venting her emotions. She started angrily yelling in French at the attendant, who watched us shout and scream and drown in our own pain. Eventually both me and Inez ran out of breath, and in the moments of silence the attendant spoke to us.
I am sorry, but it is true. Each of you have died, and on your path to your final rest you have stopped here, in the Aldivirn Lodge, for respite. As I said before, once you leave, you shall cease to be.
Trevor quietly sipped his drink. There was still that accepting smile on his face, and I could only guess that he had figured all this out long before we had. He looked up at the attendant, who turned their gaze to him. I watched the old man make some gestures towards them, and they said,
Yes, she was here. She asked a favour of me, to tell you that she loved you, and that she hopes to see you on the other side. She seemed a kind and wise woman, and she took the news as well as you did.
Trevor smiled and nodded. He then made a few more gestures, to which the attendant shook their head.
I'm sorry, but there is no afterlife. No rebirth, no new beginning. There is simply oblivion. But, if it gives you any solace, you shall be one with the same realm of nothingness as your wife. In a sense, you will finally be reunited, even if you may never see her again.
Trevor gave a sad little chuckle and took another sip of his drink. I could see that there were tears in his eyes, but the emotion they contained was far more complex than simple happiness or sadness. When the attendant mentioned Trevor's wife, I saw Inez punch the bar and make a pained scream. The attendant just watched silently. Quiet, furious sobs were coming from Inez. There was a part of me that wanted to join her, to just curl up into a ball and cry, but the part of me that was mostly a gaping hole simply swallowed the attendant's explanations and cried out in denial. I could not be dead. I simply could not be dead. The attendant turned to face me.
You do not believe me, do you? Would you turn away from your fate?
Shut up! Shut up! I can't be dead. Stop talking about fate and oblivion and last words. It's not true. It can't be. I was standing now, staring the attendant down. They made no sign of being intimidated.
Those doors. The numbers. They're dates, aren't they? They're the day we died.
Yes, you are quite correct. You each have a door in the corridor. I believe you had already figured that out. Isn't that right, Mr. Patel?
The memory of that door pushed me over the edge. There was another flare of anger inside of me, and I threw my fist out toward the attendant, screaming in anger as I did. They made no attempt to block the punch. Instead, I watched and felt my hand go through them like there was smoke. The momentum sent me forward and almost over the bar.
Mr. Patel, this is not going to...
But I cut the attendant off as my fist flew out again. I hit nothing, but I kept trying until I couldn't keep my resolve. I looked at their cold, dark features, which were completely unfazed, and felt utterly defeated.
Sit down, Mr. Patel. You are not the first to react in such a way, and I do not think you shall be the last. But I assure you there are easier ways to handle your self-grief.
I sat down on the bar stool and sipped my half-finished drink. Its lovely taste helped somewhat. It tasted like being alive.
Attendant, do you have my ring? Please. If you do, I need you to give it back to me.
You did not bring your ring to this lodge, Miss Marchand. That ring was a symbol of your love, your connections to the people you care about most. In some ways, it was perhaps your reason to live. It encompassed so much of your life that you could not take it with you to your death. I must apologize, but you will never see that ring again.
Inez simply nodded and stared at her hand longingly.
So what's going to happen? Why are we trapped here?
All those who die must take a journey to their own oblivion. Currently, you are in a limbo between being and nothingness. This lodge is your respite, and the moment you leave, you will cease to be.
The anger was subsiding into hopelessness. That's wrong. It can't be true. It's not. Fair. I mouthed the words rather than speak them, because I knew how childish they were.
Of course this is not fair. Fairness implies some grand cosmic system of right and wrong, that the just are rewarded and the guilty are punished. I'm afraid there is no such thing. You have died, and now all there is to do is make peace with that fact.
How could I make peace with my own death? I couldn't even accept it was true. Dying was something you could understand in theory, but the actual, visceral comprehension of your own mortality was the kind of thing that kept people up at night. It was the kind of thing that sent them spiralling into depression. At this point, I felt like I was barely half the person I used to be. How could I comprehend my own death like that?
Is this like the underworld, then?
Not quite. But if it helps you process this, then by all means think of it as a Styx or purgatory.
So there must be some way out, right? That's how all the stories go. There's some way out, like an exit or a game we could play for our souls. Chess or something.
I watched the attendant shake their head.
Unfortunately, that is not how this lodge works. Your only option is to accept your death and move on. I do not say this to cause you to despair or to fool you. If there was a way back, I would tell you. But in all the time I have spent here, no one has gone back. Not without trying, mind you. But they all failed, and eventually they learned to accept their mortality rather than deny it.
Trevor finished his drink and eased himself off his seat. In that moment he looked very old. The attendant bowed to him and said,
I hope you have enjoyed your stay at the Aldivirn Lodge. My respect to you for your delightful conduct during your time here. Mr. Deacole Trevor wishes for you all to know he has enjoyed the time he has spent in your company. He feels that he would have very much liked to have known you in life, and he is truly sorry that you have had your lives cut short. He understands that accepting your deaths shall be difficult, especially when you had so much more life to live. But he hopes you will find some solace in this place.
Trevor was mouthing along with the attendant. Doubtless what the attendant said was Trevor's words. I had nothing to say to the man. I felt if I did, it would be tantamount to admitting everything the attendant had said was true. I couldn't do that, so I turned away from him, all while never letting him out of my peripheral vision. While I had nothing to say to him, Inez did. Without looking at him, she said,
How is what you are doing any different to ending your own life? You are killing yourself by leaving this place. You understand this, yes?
Trevor shook his head gently while the attendant replied,
No, he is not ending his life. It has already ended, you see. You can feel it, surely. All of you have left so much of yourselves behind. The parts of you that proved you were alive, perhaps. Accepting mortality is not the same as killing yourself. If anything, it is more like realizing you were alive in the first place.
Inez didn't respond to that. She had looked away, just as I had, and would not justify these words with a response. Alex just stood there, next to the old man, with her head bowed and her arms hanging against her sides. In a monotone, I heard her whisper,
Just go, then.
Trevor looked at the girl, and in a single motion pulled her into a hug. Alex didn't fight back, but she didn't return the hug either. Her arms didn't move from her sides. When Trevor broke the hug, I saw that there were tears in his eyes. He quickly wiped them away, took a deep breath, and turned to me and Inez. He bowed to say goodbye, and I just nodded. Inez couldn't even bear to look at him. Then the old man turned his back to us and left the room, the sound of the door closing echoing out from the emptiness in my chest. And with that, Trevor was gone. Chapter 7. Smoke. I needed to be alone, away from my companions and away from the attendant. Without speaking, I got out of my seat and I left the room. Nobody said anything as I left, and I was glad of that. I sat on the stairs that led down to the second floor, that infinite corridor, and just sighed. I wished I had a cigarette, not because I craved a nicotine rush, but because it seemed appropriate. I reflected that I'd probably never crave anything ever again. I sat there for a while, not really thinking about anything, just sort of stewing in that emptiness. Without any outside force affecting me, I probably would have stayed on that step forever, but I was interrupted by Inez opening the door and joining me. She held 2 cigarettes and a lighter out for me to take. "So," I said to Inez, the cigarette making talking easier, "what do you think of all this? You believe the attendant? The espèce de serviteur, as you called them?"
What I believe is that I am currently dreaming. Tomorrow I shall awaken in my fiancé's arms to tell him of the strange dream I had. We will laugh and our lives shall go on.
I took another drag. "Yeah," I said, "everything being a dream is what I'm bagging on too." The conversation lulled, and we sat in silence, smoking our cigarettes. Eventually I said, "If you think this is all a dream, why don't you just leave?" She looked at me with disdain.
Of course I cannot just leave. You know that just as I do.
And despite everything, despite how much I wanted to deny anything that might have made me believe I was dead, I knew she was right. We didn't talk again for a while after that, until eventually I said, "Shall we go and check on Alex? I don't think we should leave her with the attendant too long." Inez shrugged before dropping her cigarette to her feet and stomping on it. She stood up and brushed off some non-existent dust.
Well?
I nodded and dropped my cigarette. I noticed that in all the time we had spent smoking, it hadn't burnt down a millimetre. I put it out with my foot anyway, and joined Inez in returning to the bar. Walking back into the bar room, I saw that Alex was playing chess with the attendant, whilst half-heartedly poking at an ice cream sundae. As we approached, I saw the attendant move one of their pieces and heard them say, "Checkmate," in their characteristic monotone.
3 losses in a row, huh? Can I even beat you at this? Seriously, it's like you can read minds or something.
I will only view your thoughts if it is required of by my duty. I can lose purposefully if you wish.
That's kinda creepy. And no thanks, I'm done with this game.
Very well.
Inez and I returned to our seats. Alex gave us a little wave as we sat down. Inez stared at the attendant intently.
Tell me, espèce de serviteur, what are your duties here?
I have many smaller duties, most of which involve maintaining this lodge and attending to your requests. But my main duty is to guide you towards acceptance. You might say I am a psychopomp of sorts.
You take care of the lodge?
Yes. The place would fall into disrepair if I did not.
What's behind the doors, then?
I am not at liberty to say. It is one of the rules of this place, you see.
And who makes these rules? Is there a god who we must worship?
I do not know. Perhaps it is the lodge itself. Or perhaps there is some great cosmic deity who writes the laws we must all abide by. I do not know. And I must ask. Does it matter?
Inez said yes, just as I said no. She gave me a look, like she was annoyed I hadn't agreed with her, but didn't say anything else.
Those doors. There's one for everybody who's been here, right?
And one for every person who shall come here.
So I have one, yeah? I want to see it. Take me there.
There was no hesitation in her voice, and that was what sent the sharp jab of fear through me, and I did not know why.
Very well.
The otherworldly psychopomp disappeared when I blinked, and I found them again standing by the door. They held it open like a valet and waited for Alex to walk through. Alex left her seat before I could find the words to say to her and left the room with the attendant. Without thinking, I left my chair and ran after them to the great corridor below. Chapter 8. Beyond the Grave Door. I managed to catch up with Alex and the attendant. Alex barely glanced at me when I approached, instead turning away to follow the psychopomp. I'd desperately been ignoring the doors, praying I'd missed the one with my own name on it. Although it seemed praying was quite literally pointless if the attendant was right, and even if they were wrong, I doubted any god would listen to me. I reached out to grab Alex's shoulder, but she shook me off. I wasn't even sure why I cared so much about stopping her from reaching her door. Maybe it was because I knew the nausea it would bring, or maybe I just didn't want to know what was behind those doors. Maybe it was just because I knew that whatever was behind the doors would either prove or disprove my own mortality. The reason, or even the fact I had a reason, probably didn't matter, because the look on Alex's face wasn't of one of fear or sadness, but cold, emotionless determination.
What, Samir?
You don't have to do this. Your door, you don't have to open it. You don't even have to look at it.
Yeah, I do, Samir.
Alex, listen to me. You don't understand.
No, Samir, you don't understand. Don't treat me like a kid. In 14 years, I've probably seen worse stuff than you have in your whole life. I'm pretty sure I know what's behind my door, but I have to know for sure. I can't stay in this place where I'm either dead or alive. I've got to be one or the other. If you want to stay here, go ahead. But don't try and stop me from opening my door just 'cause you're in denial. I've got to keep moving forward, okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
We are here.
The door was just like all the others, dark oak and a name and a number. The name read Julianne Rule, and the number read 08112006. Alex stared at it, and I saw her grab her right wrist and grip it tightly.
I thought your name was Alex.
I realized Inez must have caught up with us at some point.
I don't like telling people I don't trust my real name.
Inez nodded respectfully at that.
Smart girl.
Plus Julianne is a stupid name.
Alex's hand reached out for the brass door handle. I saw her hand shake and her eyes dilate, but somehow she still managed to grip it. Before she turned the handle, she turned to me and Inez.
Do you mind if I get some privacy? I don't want anyone else to see this, okay?
Inez and I nodded, and we turned our backs to Alex. We heard the sound of the handle turning, of the door creaking, and of Alex's footsteps, and then we heard the sound of the door closing. And then we heard nothing at all. I don't know how long we stood there in silence. It was probably minutes, but if the attendant was right, then time was an irrelevant factor. Eventually, I heard the door open again, and Alex walked out. Neither Inez nor I found the strength to turn to face her.
How are you feeling, Miss Rule?
Did you know?
She was gone. I could hear it. Any life she had was gone, and he had left her the moment she had stepped inside that door.
Yes. I am sorry for withholding the information. I felt you needed to see it for yourself.
No, you were right. It's just... I didn't want this. Whatever I was feeling before, it's gone. But I don't feel better. I just feel... empty.
That is a common feeling.
I felt desperately like I should say something, but I'd lost the ability to speak once again. The emptiness in my heart, which I had allowed myself to ignore, had yawned open again, and I felt every part of me begin to be swallowed by it.
That door has always been there, right? Was it always going to end this way?
I do not know. I am not granted knowledge of the rooms until their occupant arrives. I like to believe that, until then, they are empty, that nothing is set in stone in such a way. But, truthfully, I do not know.
Figures.
We stood in silence for a few moments before Alex said,
Trevor told me he thought I was such a strong young girl that even though he'd only known me for a short time, he was proud of me for staying strong. I wonder if he'd say that if he could see me now.
No one could answer her. I heard Inez ask,
So, what shall you do now?
Now? Keep moving forward, I guess.
I knew what that meant, but I didn't want to think about it. Are you going to be all right? I forced myself to ask her. I wasn't fully sure I wanted to hear the answer.
Where I'm going, you don't need to be all right. But yeah, I'll be all right. I just had to know, you know? I do now, and it hurts, but at least I can move forward. At this point, I guess that's all I can do.
Are you ready, Miss Rule?
Yeah, I am.
Then I hope that you have had a pleasant stay at the Aldivirn Lodge. I wish you a peaceful rest.
To us, I heard Alex say,
I guess this is kind of goodbye. I hope you guys start moving forward too.
and with that, I heard her begin to walk away, those heavy footfalls slowly getting quieter as she left. I pushed myself, and I managed to turn around just in time to see her disappear into the darkness. Chapter 9. Emptiness. I fell against the wall of that endless corridor and felt myself sink down to the floor. Had that void inside me grown after Alex's departure? Or had the sheer magnitude of its size only now become apparent to me? Inez stared in the direction Alex had left us, her expression telling me she was lost in thought. The attendant stood by, silently waiting our next course of action.
You know, this may be the first time in my life I have ever felt alone. For I was always doted by my parents or friends or lovers. But now, look at you. You are barely even people. No, you are not people at all.
The attendant was silent, but it didn't matter. She was mainly talking about me. She waited for a response, but I had none for her. I was so tired. Tired of speaking, tired of existing. That emptiness kept robbing me of anything to dispute her with, anything to prove and argue in favour of my own existence. It took everything I had to look up and meet her in her eyes.
Why are you looking at me, Samir? Do you not have anything to say? Will you not get angry or upset or anything else that can tell me you're still alive?
She waited for a moment before turning away from me. Once her eyes were off me, I closed them and listened. I heard Inez walk away, but there was none of the finality in her footsteps that had characterised Trevor and Alex's departures. I don't know where Inez was going, but she wasn't leaving the lodge. Not yet, anyway. I was left alone with the attendant. They stood at a respectable and professional distance from me, waiting to fulfil their duties. Their duties included convincing me that I had died, that I was currently sitting in a lodge in limbo, and that in order to move on I had to leave. I didn't have the strength to feign denial anymore. But at the same time, the concept of my own death was this vague concept. It was alien to me, and it was uncomfortable. Perhaps this was what Alex had meant by needing to see what was beyond the door, to kill this uncomfortable feeling of limbo. I could feel, as much as I could feel anything anymore, my fingers dig into my leg. Could I have sat there forever? Probably. After all, I didn't get hungry, or thirsty, or tired. I couldn't get sick or injured. I was functionally immortal. I didn't have to disappear, and yet... If I'm dead, I said to the attendant, how did I die? I wasn't sure I wanted to know, but there was a morbid curiosity inside of me now, slowly bubbling to the surface. As I fell deeper into that empty sensation, I grasped out for anything that could hold me up, and that curiosity was what I found.
I am not at liberty to say. But if you believe it will assist you in reaching acceptance, then I can guide you to where you may find the answer.
What difference is there in telling me now?
The difference, Mr. Patel, is that if I told you, you would not believe me.
And with that, the attendant turned and began walking down the eternal corridor. I struggled to my feet and began falling in step behind them. My movements felt so off, like I was a marionette being manipulated by a novice puppeteer. Was even my own motor function falling into that emptiness, that void? As we walked, I began to wonder how I died. Heart attack, maybe? Perhaps a mugging or a hit and run. Many people, thinking about their own death, hope for that sort of good death that appears in movies and books. When they're just hanging on by a thread long enough to be surrounded by friends and family, they say their last words and give some goodbyes and then peacefully fall into darkness. That couldn't happen to me. I didn't have any friends or family to say goodbye to. They had all turned their back on me long ago. If I had died in my own flat, the person who'd found my body would probably be the landlord. A morbid joke crossed my mind then, and that was, at least he won't be able to evict me now. Had I killed myself? I made myself a Scotch and Valium cocktail and left that mortal coil? I couldn't shake that thought, and I felt no strong emotion to it either. I just felt empty. How all-encompassing this sensation was, that even the thought of my own suicide elicited nothing in me. All the same, there was still that curiosity. It drove me forward, and aside from the emptiness, it was perhaps all I had left. I was focusing so much on my own thoughts, I almost walked into the attendant. They were standing before one of the doors. I heard them say,
"We have arrived,"
in that monotone voice I had become so used to. They gestured toward the door, and I saw the name and date that was printed on it. The nausea returned in waves as I looked upon it, because of course, it was my name.
"If you are not prepared to open the door, I can take you back."
Was there a hint of sympathy in their voice, or was it pity? I shook my head. "No," I said. "I've got to do this, haven't I? It's how this place works. It takes everything from you and just leaves emptiness behind. My only hope is whatever is behind that door gives me something, anything to stop that void swallowing the rest of me." It was the attendant's turn to shake their head.
"The lodge took nothing from you, Mr. Patel. That emptiness you feel is the sensation of the dead. The pain that used to fill that void has been left in the land of the living. But, despite all of this, you still have a choice. If it is truly what you wish, you do not have to open that door. You can stay here in this lodge until the universe itself has faded into oblivion."
"Has anyone ever taken you up on that offer?" I asked them.
"No. No mortal has ever made this lodge their residence. Although many have tried, the emptiness is too much for them to bear."
"Figures," I said. My eyes were back on the door, and dull fear and nausea could be felt in the pit of my stomach. I saw my hand reach out for the door, entirely of its own accord, and I didn't stop it this time. I shivered as my hand gripped the door handle. When I didn't feel my hand turn, I realised I would have to do that myself. I took one last look at the attendant, let my fear be swallowed by the emptiness, and opened the door. A blinding wall of white light held within the door frame. Without hesitation, I stepped through it, and came to see the truth. Chapter 10. Revelation. As my vision returned, I found myself standing in my old flat. It was a mess, and I was surprised that I had never noticed how much of a mess it was. Bin bags were piled up next to the front door, empty bottles of vodka or whiskey were everywhere, stolen ashtrays were overflowing with cigarette snubs. I couldn't smell anything, but I assumed the place probably reeked of ethanol and tobacco. The room was dark, with only a slither of light coming from the kitchen down the hall. I knew then that I was in there, or at least what was left of me anyway. I took a deep breath and started moving forward. As I reached the ajar door, I saw a pool of blood in the light. I slipped through the crack and into my wreck of a kitchen. The bottles and cans were just as ever-present as before, but most of them had been thrown against the wall and smashed into 1,000 pieces. Joining them was the majority of my dishes, one of the cupboard doors, and the faucet from my sink. The sink itself was overflowing with water, which was spilling out all over the floor. My lifeless body was lying in that water, next to a broken whiskey bottle. There was a massive gash in my head where blood was seeping out and mixing with the tap water. I could see on the corner of the countertop there was another splattering of blood where I must have hit my head. I scanned the room for an empty bottle of pills, but found nothing. I had to accept that whatever this was, it was no suicide attempt. I stared at the body that used to be mine, and thought it looked so pathetic. It was all emaciated, and had an alcohol-soaked puffiness to it. Had I really looked like that in my final moments? And this death, it was so meaningless. I had died alone, by accident, and without anyone in the world to care. If I could have cried in that moment, maybe I would have. I had to wonder how long it would be until someone found the body. Maybe someone would complain about the stench of death, leading to my landlord coming in and dragging my body out. Would that be the sum of my life? A complaint from a neighbour who probably hadn't even realised I existed, and a bill for a cleaning company that specialised in blood? I realised in that moment how truly, utterly inconsequential my life had been. Looking down on that sickly mass of flesh and bone, I wondered how I had never realised it before. I used to believe my life had meant something, that it was worth something, that I was worth something. I could see now that I was wrong. You can understand how trivial you are in concept, but truly realising it, Understanding it deeply, it was like a death in of itself. I don't know how long I spent staring at my corpse. I could feel the embers of the emotions I should have felt. Fear, sadness, anger, despair. But above all that, I just felt empty. And of course I felt empty. The pain I felt in life was so colossal, it practically was all I used to feel. I just needed to look around the kitchen to know that. The pain was gone now, left behind on a blood-soaked floor. A pathetic end to a pathetic life, I suppose. Chapter 11. The Mountain and the Abyss. I turned away and returned to the endless corridor. The attendant was waiting for me, while Inez was not. I wrestled with the conflicting wishes to be silent forever and to cry out against my fate. Where had that come, I wonder? I was hollow, like a rotting tree, and yet I felt something that was perhaps the closest I had come to being alive in a long time. Those embers of emotion coalesced into something that drove me forward. I turned to the attendant, but I did not know yet what words to say.
How do you feel, Mr. Patel?
I stared at them for some time, and then let myself speak. Stop acting like that. Stop pretending that any of our lives, especially mine, had some significance. You knew what was out there. You know who I am, or who I used to be anyway. I'm nothing. A collection of atoms and electrical impulses who no one will ever know existed, who died alone and unknown by the world at large. Yeah, you want to know how I feel? I wish I'd never been born. That was the last of it. All the embers had either burnt out or were scattered to the wind. We stood in silence, and then the attendant began to speak, and all I could do was listen.
You are despairing because you feel that your death, much like your life, was inconsequential, correct? That you are unrecognized, never to be known or remembered or seen. Well, think of humanity like a great mountain, standing above an infinite abyss, and that your death was like a shard of rock falling from the mountain and into the darkness. You are despairing because nobody watched or recognized you fall from the mountain, that nobody cared. Well, tell me, who will watch when the mountain itself crumbles into the abyss? In the end, the rock must accept that only they will know that they fell, as must the mountain. In a way, they are the same. Do you understand?
Did I understand? It was a valid question. On some level I must have. Facing down my own corpse gave me some insight into what the attendant was saying. I replied, "Does it matter if I do? I still wasted the life I was given. What good is there in self-recognition if the only thing you recognize is how alienated and isolated you were? How much I had wasted the life I was given."
You did not waste your life, Mr. Patel. You simply lived it. I have known every mortal to ever live, even if it was only for a moment. So many of them, most of them even, believed that they had wasted their allotted time. But there is no measure of a life well lived. Perhaps the struggle of living is enough. In the end, they were all just people. Nothing more and nothing less.
So all of us are doomed to face oblivion then? No matter who we were, we all just end up in the same place?
Yes, in the end, you are all just people.
That doesn't seem right. On so many levels, every unique individual, all of whom seen the world in slightly different ways, will disappear. What was the point of being able to collect memories and feel emotions if it all has to end in nothing? I expected the attendant to interrupt me, but they left me to my ranting. I didn't need to breathe, so I just kept speaking. And what about all the people who make the world a miserable place? Those who stand on towers of bodies and let the world burn? What about them? You're telling me that they get no punishment? All of it seems wrong. It's not
fair. You are right. It is not. But ideas such as justice, what is right and what is wrong, fairness, they are ideas for the living. The dead must let them go.
I just nodded. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do now. I wasn't sure I wanted anything, except more time. I knew that time was one of the few things the attendant could not, give me. You give a lot of speeches. You know that?
Yes, I suppose I do.
I wondered for a moment if there was a shadow of a smile on their face. Well, thank you for your service. I think I want to be alone for now.
Of course, Mr. Patel. I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed your stay at the Aldivirn Lodge.
They bowed and then they were gone. I was left alone in that empty corridor. I began to walk toward the stairs and back to the entrance. Chapter 12. When the End Comes. Inez was in the parlour room, in that same armchair I had first seen her in. My arriving in this lodge seemed like such a long time ago. She paid me no mind as I came down the stairs. Instead, she was staring deep into the dull flames of the fireplace. It seemed so strange to think this place had a fireplace. After all, what do the dead need with light and heat? I sat back in my chair and stared into the fire. The flickering was so quiet now, like it was just a memory. I noticed Inez was watching me, but I had little need to say anything to her. I knew all would come out eventually.
I would like to apologize for what I said before. It was rude and beneath me.
I turned my gaze back to her. She seemed so fleeting, less here than the shadows that danced on the wall. I said to her, "No, it wasn't uncalled for at all. If anything, it was one of the truest statements I've heard since getting here."
Pardon?
We are all just ghosts of who we were. You, me, Trevor and Alex too, probably. And maybe what we left behind was awful or great or something in between, but either way, we're less because we don't have it anymore. Shadows, you know?
I fear I may have been a shadow in life too. I was the shadow of whoever I tied myself to, be it parents or my fiancé. I was not a real person. I was a part of them. I have lost my ring because that ring was all I had. All I was. Bride, a wife, perhaps one day a mother. Not once did I ever think I could be anything else. I was simply led through life by the hand, like a small child.
Inez, you haven't wasted your life. You've just lived it. Inez nodded, and we sat in silence for a while. It was strange speaking. Once I realised that the emptiness wasn't something that was taking away from me, that it was instead my very being, talking had become easier. It was like I didn't have to think about strength or word choice or even language anymore, because those were concepts for the living, not the dead.
Do you think the servitor will join us? I feel I should apologise to them too.
They'll probably come if you want them to. But why? Apologies are for the living, surely.
The servitor seems more alive than you or I. They deserve some respect for their service.
You're probably right. But don't worry. They know. Inez nodded at this, and the look in her eyes reminded me of something. Are you not going to cry anymore? I asked. It wasn't an insult. It was just an observation, and Inez seemed to take it like that.
No. I think I have run out of tears to cry, as you would say. Tears are for the living, not the dead, I think.
Do you think people will grieve for you?
I am sure there will be a very sombre, very tasteful service with a priest reading a lovely and false eulogy. Everyone will show a respectable amount of sadness, and then they shall move on with their lives. Quite quickly, I expect.
And how do you feel about that?
I was a shadow. People who grieve for shadows momentarily, and then find a new one. I think I always knew this. I can make peace with it if there is nothing else to do.
I can understand that feeling. Tell me, do you still think this is a dream?
You're asking a lot of questions, Samir. But no, I stopped believing this was a dream around the time I lost my ability to cry. I am not sure if one caused the other, and truthfully, I do not really care.
Right, I said. It's just, you made me think. Maybe being alive is like dreaming, and when we die, it's when we wake up. Good or bad, a dream is still a dream. It has to end.
Perhaps it is time to wake up.
I watched her stand from her chair and stretch. I saw she was holding out her hand for me to take. Anger and sadness had left her face, and now all I saw was a funeral mask. She was not alive, but I could see that it was peaceful, if nothing else. I wondered if I too wore such a mask. Perhaps. I can't stay here and wait for the end to come. I stood, and I took her cold hand. We began to walk toward the door we had entered this lodge from so long ago. The door opened into a dark abyss, and I thought for a moment that despite how much I wished I could go back, go live an entire other lifetime, I was glad I was not walking into the darkness alone. Maybe that was enough. We stepped through the door and returned to oblivion.